Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrell, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by ACE, the HR Exam, and Upskill HR. These are two of the courses that I offer for certification prep and recertification for human resources leaders. You can learn more about these courses over at Workology.com. Come on by, learn about our courses that we have. This podcast is part of a new series that I'm calling the HR Basics series. It's where we cover common yet complicated topics within the world of human resources. And for the HR Basics series, I am tapping into the HR consultant brain trust. So I'm talking to HR consultants to help guide us in these very complex areas of our field within human resources. And in every single episode of HR Basics, we are talking to an HR consultant who supports multiple clients and customers, providing them things like consulting, advising, and other support services for businesses of all sizes and industries. I love series like this. It is so much fun. And in this specific episode, we're talking about employee communication. Employee communication. Effective employee communication is crucial in HR leadership. And as you will see, it is one of the most common areas that companies can either fix or fail. During times of organizational change, effective communication helps employees understand and adapt to new situations, processing that resistance, and overcoming and maybe understanding their anxieties. It also ensures that employees are clear about their roles and their responsibilities. This helps also create a feedback loop for process improvements, which we all need. Communication shapes and maintains organizational culture. It aligns employees with the organization's values and those desired behaviors. What happens when communication goes wrong? Well, I think we've seen it all over the news. We've read those articles. We've watched the videos. We've maybe worked for companies where this has happened. And I think that you and I both know that this is always an area that can be improved upon, which is why so many companies rely on HR consultants in this area for support. Now, before I introduce our guest for today, I do want to hear from you. Please comment podcast on the pinned Instagram post over on my Instagram account. It's at Workology Blog, where you can ask questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future guests. I do want to hear from you. Communication and your feedback is important always. I want to walk the talk and do the things. Today's guest is Leanne Lagasse. She is an HR consultant and keynote speaker who helps leaders and organizations improve their employee engagement and their listening strategies, and also develop their people managers. So Leanne is a SHRM Senior Certified Professional, a Gallup Certified Clifton Strengths Coach, and also serves as the adjunct faculty at Missouri State University, where she teaches professional communication courses to Master's in Business Administration students. Prior to launching her consulting business, Leanne was a faculty member and the director of public speaking at the College of Media and Communications at Texas Tech University, where she served for 14 years. Alongside her husband, Ben, she is the proud mom to 3 children and 2 pet prairie dogs. Oh my gosh, prairie dogs. I'm so excited to welcome Leanne to the Workology Podcast.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
We can talk about prairie dogs, and or maybe people can, send in their questions for future conversations around prairie dogs, because my 15-year-old is really begging me not for a prairie dog, but for a ferret, which I feel like is unusual. Also prairie dogs. But let's talk a little bit about your background and what led you to work in HR consulting, because it's an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, so as my bio, shared, my background is in higher education. So my graduate work was in communication, and I really specialized in interpersonal and organizational communication. And really that's just a way of saying, how do we study the way in which human beings send, receive, attach meaning to messages, and how do we do that in a corporate or organizational environment? So I was a professor for 14 years, and during that time I was just had a blast. I got to teach all sorts of just awesome content to undergraduate and graduate students around, organizational communication, interviewing processes and procedures, nonverbal communication, intercultural, gender and communication, corporate training. And so as you're hearing me talk through those courses, it makes sense. There's so much overlap there with communication and the work that HR practitioners are doing, where people are doing on a day-to-day basis. And so I didn't really anticipate that I would be an HR consultant one day. The role I was in, there was a really heavy administrative function. I had a large staff I had about 30 direct reports, which is wild. I look back on that and I don't know how I did that, but don't recommend it. But I had a really large group. And so I owned a lot of the HR function in the role that I was in, but I didn't really anticipate, I'd be an HR consultant. What happened was I was teaching and deploying all this content. And then I thought, man, I really would love to start helping organizations with this. And originally I was sort of working more towards building my messages for executive leaders. And I still do that in some capacity, but really the HR crew, kind of the HR vibe kind of found me. And I think it's funny because I talk to people all the time who say, yeah, I didn't start out thinking I was going to land in HR, but HR sort of happened to me in this beautiful way. And that's kind of how it worked out. So now I get to do work with leaders and organizations of all shapes and sizes and help them with their employee engagement and retention, and also in internal communication strategies. And I love the HR and the people, and just can't imagine doing anything else, TBH. Yeah.
I love that. And so much of what we do is internal communication. So it totally makes sense to me. And I, like 15 years ago, I did this presentation. I kind of made the state conference circuit for a little while. And the title was HR is the new PR. And so I feel like a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, like the transition makes sense, except that as an HR professional, like our experience and our expertise is rooted in a lot of administrative or employment law, where your expertise is on that communication side, helping us get up to speed in a really important area, which is employee communications.
Yeah, I sometimes will tell people that I kind of reside in, like, if there's a Venn diagram, I'm sort of in that sweet spot for me is where employee engagement and retention meets strategic communication. And so that's where I help leaders and organizations the most. I think that's where I bring the most value, is in that sort of little overlap, that little intersection.
I love that. And I feel like employee communication it touches everyone, but especially HR, since we kind of are the keepers of the people and oversee a lot of employee engagement and then all those turnover conversations.
Yes. Yep. Buckle up. Yeah.
Buckle up is right. Let's talk about your approach to coaching and consulting and how you work with business leaders, whether it's HR or those executives.
Yeah. So I will describe the work that I do in my approach as evidence-based and communication-centric. So everything that I do to work with an organization is highly, customized, because at my core of cores, I just believe that every single organization is unique enough that it warrants unique approaches, unique tools, unique strategies. And there are some general things that apply across the board. I think, like, we know what employees need. There's a lot of research there, but I think what works for one organization, as everybody listening to this already knows, is not going to work for another organization. So what I like to do is bring in almost a toolbox to say, hey, let me dig in and do some almost kind of nerdy research work on the front end and figure out what are the tools and strategies that are going to help you streamline some of these processes, bolster your employer brand because you're improving your internal communication and those communication rhythms in the organization. The offerings that I provide usually for organizations, I do a lot of kind of custom manager equipping. But the heart of that equipping is about communication. How do we use, as if I'm a brand new rookie manager, I was an individual contributor. I was really successful in my role. And suddenly now I realize that the outcomes are not coming as naturally anymore because, it's not just dependent on me. So how do we use communication to drive engagement and retention? So I help a lot with manager equipping around communication and engagement. I do a lot of employee listening consulting. So I'll go in and help organizations assess their communication rhythms and those, official communication channels that they're using. And then I will facilitate employee engagement surveys and focus groups or stay interviews, and then help leaders build some strategic communication plans about how to communicate back to employees, but also then to take action on that. And I do some coaching as well, but really the bulk of what I do is around equipping, training, workshops, and then employee listening.
I love it all. I feel like job security for you. Every time an announcement comes out where some company did something wrong, announcing layoffs or terminating someone, or somebody sent out an email that was somebody in the organization should have stepped in and said, hey, we might want to rethink this. So I always say job security for HR, but definitely job security for you. I feel like it's never ending in the media.
It's so true. I have to actually be really careful. I was just telling someone the other day, the social media algorithms have me figured out because they show me stuff every day. They're like, they know I'm going to get mad about this. They know I'm going to see this example and think, what in the world, but you're right. I mean, communication is something that, here's the deal. Everybody thinks they're a better communicator than they are. In fact, what most research shows is if you ask leaders to rank themselves on a scale of 1 to 10, how effective of a communicator do I think I am? Most leaders will kind of hover around, if they're being real humble, they'll say, maybe a 7, I'm a 7, I'm an 8. But when you ask their direct reports to rank them on a scale of 1 to 10, it's more like a 4 or a 5, And so we all tend to think we're better communicators than we are, which is why we end up with stuff like this in the media, to your point.
That 360 feedback is brutal. It is so brutal, but so important if you are a leader who's focused on your own personal or professional improvement, maybe in an area like employee communication.
Oh, it's so true. And not only do you get the data that's helpful for you to hopefully grow and learn through that, but you also send a message, which this is the communication piece. You're also, when you engage in those kind of practices in your organization, you're also sending the message that, as it turns out, we do care about the feedback that you want to communicate up. So it's kind of for lack of a better way to say it, a 1-2 punch. You get the data, but you also send a really great message in doing that.
Well, let's jump right in to this topic, which I personally think is one of the most challenging things that we do as HR professionals, which is employee communications. You've talked a little bit, but maybe dive in a little bit deeper about what is your approach for this as a consultant. If we're looking at maybe supporting an organization that wants to improve that, is there like a recipe for success?
I wouldn't say there's a recipe. I do think there's a tried and true process of critical thinking and strategic thinking around the outcomes that we want. So let's say an organization brings me in and I'm going to help them a little bit with their communication. The first questions that I'm usually asking are, okay, what are the outcomes that we want? Whether that is, around engagement and retention, whether it's around change management. I mean, it could be a host of things. But what are the outcomes that we want? So what is it that we want our audience, in this case, our team members, these people that, we value and, we think, we hope they feel like we value them, but, what do we want them to think, feel, behave, act on? What behavior modification, what, again, change management, like what are the outcomes that we want? And what can we do then to reverse engineer our messages to influence those outcomes? So for me, the process is we have to kind of go back to the drawing board. And before we actually start, for what I would say to like my kids, like just yapping, like before we just start saying stuff. So that's the email that just gets sent out, impulsively, is we slow down and we say, okay, let's think critically about the outcomes that we want and what we know about our audience. So it's a lot of audience analysis. It's a lot of situational analysis, which takes time. When I was at Texas Tech and I was a public speaking professor, I used to tell my students the difference between someone who is a gifted speaker and a phenomenal communicator is 100% in the area of audience analysis and situational analysis. You think about the best communicators it's the work that they've done in their strategic thinking before they ever send a message out. That is the difference between success and failure communicatively. So the approach for me is very much let's slow down. And, sometimes that's hard to slow down. If it's like a crisis communication situation, you may not have 5 hours to craft a statement or something, but it's slowing down enough to say, what are the outcomes we want? What do we want our audience to think, feel, believe, et cetera? And how do we reverse engineer our messages to influence those outcomes?
I love that. And as you're talking, I was Googling because there's a book, like I'm thinking about great, amazing speakers and the outcomes piece, which I feel like in business is something that consultants are focused on. Like that's the question that we ask. But a lot of times when we're in-house, we're not really focused on those. Asking those questions like, what's the outcome of this email? Or what's the outcome that you want when you are looking at hiring 25 people, right? These sort of things. So when I have looked at and done my own research to improve as a professional communicator and speaker and thinking about like my own storytelling and my content, one of my favorites is Richard Brunson, and he has a whole series of books that are all about internet marketing. And if you want to really get into, like, if you think about some of your maybe favorite professional speakers that are out there, storytellers, the amount of work and research they do prior to standing on that stage, and even body placement and movement and like how they look at you or the follow-up questions that they ask, these are all pre-planned and organized, but we don't think of it that way in workplace communications or when we're talking to our people. It's sometimes it's very much shoot from the hip. Oh, let's let HR do those things. And we aren't always in the boardroom with the bigger picture to help craft the story and share openly with employees because we just maybe aren't in the know fully.
It's so true. And I think to your point, we get in such a habit of taking for granted, especially I think leaders do this a lot, is you take for granted, you have all the context, the decision-making frameworks, you've had those conversations in a boardroom for 3 hours, made the decision, and then to your point, you just like fire off an email and you're taking for granted that the rest of your audience is lacking the context, they're lacking the nuance that you had the benefit of processing through. So when you do good audience analysis and when you do good work on what are the outcomes, and I don't mean just these abstract nebulous outcomes, I mean like concrete, what are the outcomes we want? When you do that work, you're much better poised to create messages that resonate with your audiences and end up, building positive momentum as opposed to squelching it.
I just find it fascinating. Like I'm thinking about like our own marketing that we do for some of our courses and how much time I spend on developing like a headline. What images do I use? We test that. We do A/B testing. I look at conversions. We do all these things, but we don't do that in our own employee communications. And we should, because some messages are not going to resonate and things get lost in translation, or they interpret things a completely different way.
Absolutely.
Because you're right. We as executives, we have all the information. We have spent the time to kind of work through the change and have an understanding. We have an acceptance, but then we throw out some new announcement about shifting to a new software, or maybe we're going to unlimited PTO when we have had, 21 days for most of the employees previously, like those things seem small because we have had a chance to work through all that. But our employees haven't had that same time to be able to come to that acceptance and that willingness to change.
It's so true. And I think too, when we do shoot from the hip or we fire off this communication, a lot of times what we're doing is we're thinking more about just the transmission of information as opposed to what I would say is effective communication, there's feedback, in which there's, again, a lot of context for people to understand what messages are being communicated and how do I attach meaning to these messages.
I think that flows really nicely into anything else that we want to add around what your understanding, and when I mean yours, sharing with us, the audience, of what employee communication encompasses when it comes to a company and how it's structured and organized. So walk us through that.
Yeah. So I think about this sort of back to the basics. In an organization, you really want to think about communication in terms of communication networks, right? And when we say communication networks, think just regular patterns of interaction, right? Personal relationships where information is flowing. So a question that you can ask yourself is, how is it that information flows through my organization? Now, in an organization, you've got really two major types of communication networks. You've got formal networks. And so these are the systems and the structures that we build to sort of dictate who talks to whom, how do we get jobs done, how do we accomplish something. So these are systems. And I'm getting kind of, I need a visual, Jessica. I should have brought a slide. So I'm like, I feel like I'm back in class. Hi, everyone. Okay, so imagine this on a slide, right? So you've got your formal networks, and those are the systems that you build in your organization. But under formal networks, you have really three types. You've got downward communication. Now, here's the thing. Most organizations already have some systems and structures, some formal processes in place. For example, most of our performance management rhythms and processes is downward communication. If you have a town hall and your CEO stands up and starts sharing some information, this is downward. It's a formal structure for downward communication to flow. If you have an internal podcast, which I've heard more and more organizations are doing things like that now. I think that's really cool. It's not for everybody, but I do think that's cool. That would be a formal structure for downward communication to flow, right? But then you have what we call horizontal communication. So this is in organizations where what are the systems, the formal processes that you have where collaboration and teamwork and cross-departmental communication is possible? Check this out. In most of the employee engagement surveys that I conduct, one of the weaknesses that always shows up is around communication not being open in the organization. A lot of that has to do with the formal structures that we have in place, or in this case, don't have in place. But another one that shows up a lot is about interdepartmental communication. And sometimes it'll read lack of alignment or, teams don't play well with each other. And in a lot of cases, if you dig, there aren't good formal structures in place for horizontal communication to flow or information to flow horizontally, cross-departmentally. Then you have your upward communication, which I will tell you, in 9 out of 10 organizations is the one that is in desperate need of attention, which we can, probably talk more about that later. But you got those formal networks. And so the point here of me sharing that would be to say, employee communication, there's formal structures, but then there's also informal networks. And these are patterns of interaction that are based on, friendships, like proximity, your organizational grapevine, or like the gossip mill is an example of an informal network, right? Who's an influencer that tends to move people to action independent of the formal structures we have? That's informal. I love, there's a quote that says, if the formal communication network is the skeleton of a company, the informal is the central nervous system. And so I think anytime you're going, well, what does employee communication encompass? It's our formal systems and structures, and it's all the wild, wild west, if you will, of the informal communication rhythms that happen in an organization. So that's take my professor hat off, but that's my answer to what does employee communication entail.
I am also a visual person. So sometimes when we do the YouTube videos, I'll put up some, image by the screen. So I was like, oh, a Venn diagram here.
Yeah.
Like it also says to me, like, you're probably, because of your teacher and your professor background, like more of a visual communicator.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and, and that's important. Those are all important things to think about when we're thinking about the delivery of that structured communication, and maybe ways to encourage that informal communication if more people maybe are interested in PowerPoint presentations versus a podcast. We just don't know.
Yep. It's so
That's
true.
why we have to ask.
So true.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller-Merrell, and you are listening to the Workology podcast powered by ACE, the HR exam, and Upskill HR with Leanne Lagasse, HR consultant. Comment the word podcast over on my pinned Instagram post over on @Workology blog to ask questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future guests. I do want to hear from you. If you're listening to this interview over on the Workology podcast, the full hour-long conversation is available over on my Upskill HR community. Head on over to upskillhr.com, get access to HRCI and SHRM recertification credits and PDCs for this podcast and more. We have over 100 hours of resources and training, all eligible for HRCI and SHRM recertification credits. Let's get back to our conversation with Leanne. Let's talk about how communication impacts or influences employee engagement and retention, because those in my mind are the two most important areas. They're also often really nebulous in understanding, like, what does that look like? So walk us through this area, maybe so we can educate our executive team on why this is important and how it can negatively or positively impact these.
Absolutely. I love this question. But here, okay, let's think about it like this. What do we know about employee engagement, right? If we look at any framework that exists about what are the drivers of engagement. So let's take, for example, I know what's expected of me in my role. How would somebody land at a place where they perceive that they understand their role, right? Through formal structures of communication and more probably informal as well over time, where they learn kind of what's expected of them. But that's communication is driving that perception, right? The lack of communication is going to very much affect somebody, whether they feel like they know what they expect or what's expected of them. How about this? My manager, gives me feedback that helps me do my job better as a driver for engagement. Well, what's driving that? Communication. Okay. Somebody cares about my growth and development at the organization. Well, how does that happen apart from some formal and informal communication structures that exist? Praise and recognition, which is also usually in the top 5 areas of weakness in, most organizations. How do we facilitate that? Strategic communication, both formally and informally. So the way I think about communication is it's really the vehicle that, again, it drives us to these outcomes where if we're sending the right messages across the employee life cycle that really are meeting the unique needs of employees across the life cycle, then we get to the outcomes that we want, which is higher engagement and higher retention. So talking to an executive, to me, it's an easy pitch to say, if you spend time thinking strategically about your communication rhythms, your structures across the life cycle, you will see growth and engagement and retention. I've never seen it not improve engagement and retention because the focus becomes on the messages that we're sending employees that are tied to these unique drivers around engagement. Tremendous impact it will have. I sounded like Yoda just then.
That immediately.
Tremendous impact it will have.
Oh my gosh. And this is one of those times where TikTok would tell me my age, right? So anyways, moving on. Moving on. Employee communication is a cornerstone of not just effective HR leadership, but just leadership in general. It builds trust, enhances engagement, facilitates change management, and improves productivity. It also strengthens organizational culture and helps support employee development. This also ensures compliance within, those HR things. By prioritizing clear, transparent, and consistent communication, HR leaders can help create a positive work environment and drive organizational success. That's what we want. That is part of our responsibility as HR leaders. Having some insight into very worst case scenarios like employee communication blunders can help us gain experience, which is why I appreciate Leanne's insights on the podcast today. I do believe it's our responsibility as HR experts to share what we know in places and spaces like this one. HR consulting is so much more than just training. It is hand-holding, educating, communicating, all the things, structured learning, systems, advising, counseling, and so much more. And I know I have learned so much from HR consultants in my own career who have chosen to share resources, best practice, and things they know with me. So I do appreciate Leanne sharing her expertise and experience with us today on today's podcast, all about effective communication. Comment podcast on our pinned Instagram post over at Workology blog, where you can ask questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future guests and topics, because I do want to hear from you. I love hearing from you, actually. It's one of my favorite things, other than interviews like this one. I do want to thank you for joining the Workology podcast. It's sponsored by Upskill HR. The full hour-long podcast interview, actually talked to Leanne for an entire hour. It's available over on Upskill HR. That's my online membership community over at upskillhr.com. We have over 100 hours of personal and professional development, webcasts, podcasts, videos, that and more. They're all eligible and pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM recertification credits and PDCs. Head on over to upskillhr.com to sign up and listen to the entire interview. It's got some good stuff you don't want to miss. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. That's you, that's me, that's why I do this. My name's Jessica Miller-Merrell. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our episodes of the Workology podcast. Have a great day. I will see you soon.